For some reason, nobody is talking about these weapons. What's going on, guys? I owe you guys an apology because in my last video where I talked about Duet Knight Abyss weapons, I specifically talked about Remnant's Reminiscence, which is still, in my opinion, one of the best Duet Knight Abyss weapons in the entire game. However, there are a lot of weapons that I did not go into immense detail on, and today I want to explain how weapon scaling works, what weapon proficiency does, and many, many more things. So my name is Braxophone, you can call me Brax, and I hope I can clear some things up for you, as well as show you guys what the true best weapons are in Duet Knight Abyss that people are not telling you about. So first off, let's talk about what weapon proficiencies actually are. So in my beginner's guide for Duet Knight Abyss, I mentioned that weapon proficiencies can matter for some characters, and sometimes you will end up not using weapons that align with them. However, what I did not realize at the time was how many characters would simply not be using their proficient weapon. And the reason is, and we now know it, is that weapons that you equip to your characters barely matter outside of their weapon skill or the stat bonuses that they give. The thing is, weapons seem like they are in a vacuum where the demon wedges and the effect of the weapon only affect that weapon. But as it turns out, the weapon skill specifically will affect your entire character and not just the weapon that you have equipped. What do I mean by that? Well, essentially, one of the first weapons you get in the game is called Blade Amber Glow. And this one, I'm going to also take the skin off here. This weapon is a sword that gives 60% character attack. Now, that does not only apply to your melee weapons, it actually applies to everything in your kit. The entire scaling of your character is affected by that attack, meaning that if you have a consonance weapon, that will also get the bonuses from this weapon. This means that the weapon is strictly a stat stick. Now, as far as the character attack part of this weapon goes, this doesn't actually work for every single character's consonance weapon, so this isn't the best example because character attack only applies to specific parts of character kits, but I'm going to tell you about some weapons coming up here that will apply to basically everyone and everything. Now, there are lots of weapons that have really great effects when you actually use them on the field, but the problem is that Duet Knight Abyss is a game about using abilities more so than the actual weapons themselves. A majority of the time, you are using character abilities, you are not using your basic attacks on enemies with these weapons very often, at least for most characters. So because of that, characters can end up using weapons that have good stats on them, even if they're not proficient in that weapon, because the damage that you would lose would be basically negligible. This means for a character like Berenica, for example, her having a proficiency in a sword doesn't actually matter that much because I'm not actually using her basic attacks to do damage very often because the damage that they do is basically nothing. And to show you what I'm talking about, I'm gonna go into this into this training ground real quick, and I'm just gonna slap these guys around a little bit. As you can see, I'm doing 2,000, 2,500, nothing super crazy, right? But then I use one skill, and it does the same amount of damage as all of those slashes. And because I'm on Berenica, she's getting all of her sanity back, and she can just spam it. The DPS you get from using your skill or your ultimate on any character is almost always significantly better than just using their attacks with their sword or their gun. I said sword and gun, but I meant melee and ranged weapon. Hopefully you understand what I mean. So rather than just do this to your enemies constantly, you only really care about spamming your skills or your ultimate to do the most damage possible, which is going to absolutely demolish whatever damage you are getting from the weapon that you had equipped to the character in the first place. So because a majority of our damage does not come from any of our weapons, and it just comes from the stats that we have on our character for our skills, in most cases, you can just equip anything that will give you better stats. Now, to give you an idea of what weapon proficiency actually does, so on Berenica, this sword has 174.8 spike attack. However, if I switch to Psyche, it now has 145.66 spike attack. Essentially, all weapon proficiency does is slightly boost the attack stat of the weapon that they're proficient in, and it seems to be around roughly 20% more attack if you're proficient. The problem is that this attack is only going to matter for this actual weapon's attacks and not for something like your consonance weapon, so you simply don't have to worry about it. For those reasons, some characters' quote-unquote best in slot weapons are not actually their best in slots like they were when the game was a gacha. That also means that almost every character's best in slot weapon is guaranteed to be just a weapon with the right stat bonuses on it to make that character significantly better. Now you might be wondering, what kind of weapons are those? Well, I happen to be crafting one right this second, or working on crafting one. It's kind of a long process, but This weapon, Excrestuo, I'll go ahead and pull it up in the character screen so you can see. This is a ranged weapon that's a dual pistol with 24% skill damage. This applies to everything in Berenica's kit. So if I'm trying to build the best weapon for Berenica, and Berenica does a majority of her damage with her skill and her ultimate, this skill damage, which applies to both skill and ultimate, technically ultimate is just a skill as well, will always be on and always be buffing Berenica. So even if I never use these pistols, even if the effects of other weapons seem like they might be better, since you won't actually end up using those weapons most of the time, and they won't be a majority of your damage, just getting the plain skill damage would be better. And there's other weapons that do this too. It's not just these dual pistols. This bow gives skill range. This grenade launcher gives skill range. This assault rifle gives skill duration. This pistol gives character attack, just like the first sword that we got in the game for free. And this shotgun also gives skill duration. For melee weapons, you have skill duration on Pyrothirst, the greatsword. By the way, if you want to know what any of those weapons were, just go back in the video and check the top left, they'll be there. You have skill range on these dual blades, Fathomless Shark Gaze. On the katana, you also have skill range. Wither Shade will give you 36%. If you go and look at Wainwraith, it also gives 24% skill damage by default. Going over to swords, and the sword that they give you for free, Blade Amberglow, gives 60% attack, and Tether Lash gives 18% skill duration as well. And the awesome thing about these is that as you smelt them, they get huge bonuses. So when this is completely maxed out, you should have 120% character attack bonus. That's actually no small feat. It's not something you should focus on in the early game because that won't really get you as much trial XP for the work that you're putting in. However, it is a massive buff that will always be active. So let's say you're playing Lyn, for example. The weapons that you care about for Lyn are the ones that are going to make things more efficient for you, such as skill duration, which should lower the amount of sanity cost per second, and the Blue Current Pulse pistols will do that for you. Skill duration plus 15%. But the main reason that this one is much better than this one for the 24 skill damage is because Lyn also gets increased dual pistol damage by 45%. Now you might think, well, Brax, that looks like that's only going to apply to Blue Current Pulse. Well, you might be forgetting that her weapon type of her Consonance weapon is dual pistols. What this means is that this ranged weapon, Blue Current Pulse, increases the amount of time that she's able to stay in her ultimate by making the sanity drain less aggressively, while also gaining a 45% damage bonus on her Consonance weapon, which is higher than the skill damage bonus that you would get from the other weapon. As for her melee weapon, you can give her something with skill duration, or you can give her something like the Scythe that gives a bunch more skill damage. Whatever you kind of need for your build, that's going to make things easier for you. But if there's other weapons that will also give multiple stats like skill damage bonus and skill duration or efficiency, those are even better. For someone like Psyche though, skill duration is a little less useful since she drains HP first, and you won't actually get to feel the benefits of this until you start draining sanity, which is the thing you're trying to avoid with this character. Plus her Consonance weapon isn't dual pistols. However, something like this character attack buff on her secondary, or this skill damage buff on her could also be very, very powerful and result in higher damage, even though it's not the weapon she's actually proficient with. There's also special cases with characters like Berenica where you have weapons like this, where if you trigger a bonus effect with this weapon, it increases melee weapon damage by 35%, and her Consonance weapon is a sword, which means that it's actually a higher damage bonus than the other weapons that we showed earlier, but it has a trigger effect, so you would need to shoot the weapon and have high trigger probability on the substats. This would be a full trigger probability as high as possible build on this weapon, and with it, you could actually net even higher damage. Basically, all of this is to say, in 1.0 of Duet Night Abyss, your weapon proficiency doesn't actually matter at all. Sure, it's great for when you run out of sanity and you start meleeing things, but the higher level you get and the more investment you have, the less sanity issues you'll have, especially if you just throw this sword that I talked about earlier on any of your characters. But that's also something I wanted to bring to your attention, was that even though this sword is really, really good, in the early game it tends to be even better. In the late game, this sword ends up being not as useful since you have a lot better management over your sanity, and it can be good to replace it with a stat matchstick weapon like Wainwraith the Scythe for skill damage, or depending on your character, maybe even something like skill duration. If you want an idea of what stat matters more, whether it's attack, skill damage, morale, resolve, etc., that will all be in my character build guides that come along later, so make sure to subscribe for more content. So with that said, guys, I hope this video was informative and helpful for you. I have a ton more videos that I'm working on right now, but I kind of want to post less slop. So if you guys want to see how the progress is going over on my main account, make sure to follow twitch.tv/Brax, and I will catch you guys next time.